Thank you for joining me today. My name is Alistair Oldfield. I'm a project manager for the Emeldi group. We're an official Liferay partner in the UK, Slovakia, and Czech Republic, but we operate primarily out of Europe and North America. As a Liferay partner, a question we often get from our customers and also potential customers is the question, is it possible to migrate a SharePoint CMS into Liferay? We receive this almost on a monthly basis, and in response to this question, we decided to create a tool which will actually execute this migration. So the topic of my discussion today will be the approach of this tool, how we actually execute the migration from SharePoint into Liferay. It's not really a case study, but it is based on true project experiences, but it's really a how-to guide. I'm going to discuss this I'm going to get into some technical details, but I'd like to keep everyone in context. So the way I'm going to approach this is really on a high level, basis. So this is what I'll be talking about in the next half hour. First, I'll reintroduce the topic, which is the migration from SharePoint into Liferay. I'll discuss the environments for which this migration is suitable. And generally, I will discuss the most complex and interesting environment for which we did execute this migration. And I'll also illustrate some of the challenges which we encountered along the way. The migration itself is separated into two portions. There's the migration of the content and also the migration of the functionality. And what this means is actually migrating the widgets, the web parts which exist in SharePoint, migrating these into Java portlets. Lastly, of course, I'll talk about the evaluation of the benefits which we've come across with this migration, especially in terms of automation, repeatability, and reusability of our tool. So here you see, this is just a very high-level view of what the problem space we had in front of us. We're migrating from SharePoint 2007, which is expressed in terms of web parts, which are running on .NET applications. We migrate this into Liferay, expressed in terms of portlets running on Java. So already it's quite a big port of ideas and concepts which we have to tackle for this tool. For us, this is the most complex environment which we used to do this migration. So the source environment was SharePoint Server 2007. On this environment, you see there was roughly 50 Webpart applications. These applications were highly customized, highly complex applications developed for the customer's business requirements. They were also integrated to their SOA, their backend systems, and also other third-party systems in their network. This includes also Google Maps and Google Analytics, etc. Also, to give you an idea of the sheer scale and size of this migration, we migrated about 1,000 web pages, documents, images, and articles during this migration. So it's a very large migration where a manual migration simply is not a viable option. And when we came across this problem, we were trying to figure out how are we going to approach this. Some of the options we had were to integrate directly into SharePoint through Liferay, which already exists as part of the Liferay product. We also considered integrating through the front end or the presentation layer. This meant using iframes or some proxy portlet which would execute some HTML scraping of the content output by SharePoint. And lastly, we considered migrating the entire CMS into Liferay. So ultimately, the decision we came to was that if we want to create a tool which is really a tool, then we want to create a fully migrated SharePoint to Liferay application or migration application. This meant also that our customers in the future can decommission their legacy SharePoint application and just switch on a Liferay box and have the site running on Liferay. So here we have different strokes for different folks. The first thing, once we made this decision to do the migration, complete migration of the CMS from SharePoint into Liferay, we realized, okay, they speak two completely different languages. There's different concepts and different technologies which are backing the two CMSs. So essentially, it was like fitting a square peg into a round hole. We had to do a lot of transformations in order to actually execute this migration. But what we also learned quite early on is that we don't actually need to migrate all of the data which is inside a SharePoint CMS. Firstly, because the data isn't always necessary. So Microsoft tends to bloat a lot of its data. don't need that. Also, sometimes the SharePoint data simply doesn't map into Liferay, the Liferay data model. So in these cases, we have to find a way to transform the data into something which Liferay can actually recognize. So at the end of the day, what we came up with is we decided to focus on what's really important for the migration of a website from the visitor's point of view. So what do we really care about? Obviously, the pages in the sitemap, it's very important. It's #1 thing which we had to focus on migrating, of course. Within those pages, we needed to migrate the layouts, the representation of how these pages are displayed to the visitors. Also, we needed to migrate the content. So this is the HTML, this is the articles, this is the information, which is actually contained on the pages. We also wanted to migrate all of the resources and media files, so documents, images, Flash, etc., which are in the SharePoint CMS. We needed to migrate the theme, so the look and feel, the styles of the source application. And finally, we wanted to migrate the functionality. And what this means is the migration of the web parts, the widgets. These get migrated into Liferay portlets. So when creating this tool, we imposed some additional requirements on ourselves in order to make sure that we end up with a viable, reusable tool. So the main requirement was we want to create a tool which will execute a one-to-one SharePoint migration from the visitor's point of view. So we don't care what happens behind the scene. We don't care about what's going on in the control panel, etc. This is handled by Liferay. This is Liferay native product. This is SharePoint native product. We're not going to change this. The only thing we wanted to focus on is from the user's point of view, from the visitor's point of view, they want to see the exact same site without actually realizing that it's migrated from SharePoint into Liferay. So that was our primary requirement. Everything else followed after this. We also wanted to make sure that it's an automated migration. We didn't want to create an approach which can only be used for sites of 10 pages, where only manual content migration was basically not a viable option for us. We wanted to have something that was completely automated. We also wanted to create a repeatable migration. So we can do the migration on our local dev environments first, and then once it's tested and it's okay, we can deliver to the customer. They can put it on their dev environments, their acceptance environments, and their production environments, and not have to redo any manual steps. Also, in case we found that we made a mistake somewhere or there was a bug that needed to be fixed, we wanted to be able to do so without having to rework a lot of the manual work which was already done. So this was the idea of creating a repeatable migration. Also, of course, if we want to create a tool, then it needs to be reusable, because then it's not really a tool. So the idea here was to create a migration tool which can be used for other SharePoint applications and other customers. Lastly, we wanted to be able to do these migrations offline. This meant that if, for example, we don't have 24/7 access to the customer's SharePoint database, we can just take a quick snapshot of this database and work with it as we go. Also, we wanted to allow our customers to be able to continue to work with their live production environments without having to worry that the changes they make would also affect somehow our migration. So if it took us a few weeks to execute the migration, to prepare the migration, we didn't want the customer to have to worry and freeze his production application in anticipation for the finalized migration. So here's a short, simple graphic of the approach which we used. Obviously, it's an export-import approach. You see on the left here, we created something called MOS, which is, by the way, in case for those who don't know, it's Microsoft Office SharePoint Server. MOS inspection application. This was just a standalone .NET application which inspected and traversed the CMS in SharePoint and identified all the data which was necessary for the migration. What it did with this data is it exported it into the export package, which is represented by a series of XML files, which simply just expresses the data which is there, and also the content and the media. So we exported binary files, which were the documents, the images, the media files, and we zipped these all into one directory. The last part of the migration is the import into Liferay. So we had to create an application which can read the export package, understand it, and then using Liferay APIs, import this data into the Liferay CMS. So that's the approach from the highest of levels. You see an overview of the migration itself. This is the full complete migration which has to be done. The top portion is the migration of content. This is what I just described in the previous slide. So we have the inspection or the traversal of the MOS CMS, export into a package, and then using Liferay APIs, import into Liferay. The bottom portion of this diagram is the functional migration, and this is where the work comes involved. This is where the work is involved with implementation. What this means is you must take a set of .NET Webpart applications, so all the widgets which exist in SharePoint. You need to port these into Java, portlets, and deploy these into Liferay. So we accomplished this through iterative development. We created the portlet applications which approximated the .NET applications and deployed them into Liferay. So this gives you an idea of the differences between some Liferay and SharePoint entities. Here you see, on the left you see a SharePoint what's called a SharePoint Webpart page. This is essentially a page in SharePoint. The representation is flat. You have a page, you have page data, you have layout data, you have custom data, which is also the HTML, so the web content data. You have Webpart zones, which are the drop zones for the web parts or the widgets. And then you have the web parts themselves, which are the .NET equivalent of a portlet. On the right side of this diagram, you see the Liferay representation of this exact same data. So Liferay has something called a Liferay portlet page, which represents the page and the custom fields for this page. And also Liferay has Liferay layouts, which represent the layouts of the pages and also the portlets which fit inside these pages. So these are the drop zones and the applications which fit inside of a page on Liferay. To begin to actually export the data from SharePoint, we needed to understand what is the SharePoint site structure. So this is a very simplistic representation of what a SharePoint site actually looks like. As you can see, it's a tree structure. At the root, they have something called a web, and within a web, the entire site exists. A web can have subwebs, which is below it, and that's just a nested version of itself. So webs, you can have sites within sites. Also within a web, you have something called a set of libraries. So you have the documents, the images, the lists, and other libraries and other media files. And you also have something called the default page, which is, let's say, the root page of the web, and then a set of sub-pages within this web. A page is represented by a layout, a content type, and a web part, or a set of web parts. Now what we had to do was, for each of these, I've color-coded each of these elements, and for each of these elements we needed to implement something we call a Liferay Importer, which actually imported this data into Liferay. And this is what I'll be describing for the next few slides, how this actually works. So you see here you have the SharePoint export and import approach. We have first the export. What it does, as I've mentioned before, it traverses the SharePoint CMS and spits out the data into a set of XML files. So here you see on the right what the XML is, a very simplistic representation of what the XML actually looks like. And the XML is actually, it's a tree structure. It's a representation of this exact tree which you see here. So you can see here I have something called the web. And on the following, in the XML, you have the web, and that's the root of the page, and then it has the libraries and the pages within. So once you traverse the CMS, you have a file which looks like this. Now for each of these XML elements, we need to create or implement something called a Liferay Importer, which imports the data within this element. So for the page element, for example, we create something called a page importer. I'll describe this in upcoming slides as well. So we have the export, we have the XML data, we have the binaries, and now what we need to do is import this, all of this data into Liferay. So the way we do this is it's a two-pass import. The first pass, what it does is it imports all of the libraries using Liferay APIs. So this means the documents, this means the flash files, the images, etc. When it imports these documents into, it imports the documents into the document library, it imports the images into the image gallery. Once it does this, it also needs to remember the URLs for these resources. I'll get into this later, but this is the entire purpose of the first pass, is to import the resources and get their new URLs. The second pass, what it does is it does a depth-first recursion through the entire XML. So we start at the web element there, and we invoke the web importer, and we recurse from there. The recursion, it goes all the way down to the leaf and builds the site from the bottom up. So we start with the child pages, and we build up to the root. So what happens is we start reading this XML file, we come across the web element, so we invoke the web importer, which is what we have here. So what the web importer does is it creates the default page, imports this page into Liferay, then it recurses through all of the sub-webs, repeats the recursion, and once it gets down to the leaf, it imports all of the child pages, so the sub-pages of that web, and then pops back off the stack. So how does the page importing actually look? So every time we come across a page element, we invoke the page importer. This essentially inserts a page into the Liferay CMS using Liferay APIs. We have in the XML export, we have data about the page, such as the title, the URL, screenshots, whatever you like. We have all of this data already exported in the XML. We use this data when we actually do the import into Liferay CMS. Once we import this page, we need to remember the page URL for later. It's a very similar reason for why we remember the URL on the first pass of the document imports. Lastly, every page, of course, in a site has a corresponding layout associated with it. So let's imagine a site where there's only 3 layouts defined. So we have layout X, layout Y, layout Z. Okay? So we're at some arbitrary page, and it's assigned with layout X. So what we do is we do a mapping, a lookup of all the layouts which we have, and we identify, okay, layout X, we need to invoke the layout X importer. And this is what a layout importer does. Every layout importer is a specialized importer which is bound to a very specific Liferay layout. So we create what we have to do, and this is one of the few manual portions of this migration. We need to create a Liferay approximation of a SharePoint layout. So there's no way around this. SharePoint has its own layouts, its own representation of a layout. We need to create a Liferay representation of this which somehow which closely matches this. The good news is that in most sites, you have maybe 5 different types of layouts. Generally, you won't go much further than that, which means that you don't have to, there's not too much manual work involved with this part of the migration. Also, what happens is for whatever reasons, legacy reasons, that you might have, for example, duplicate layouts. So you'll have something layout X and layout W, and they're the same. So in these cases, what you can do is you can reuse the same layout importer for the 2 layouts. So what the layout importer does is it iterates through all the drop zones on the page. It identifies which web part, which widget or portlet should go into that drop zone, and it invokes that portlet or Webpart importer. So again, let's imagine we have a very simple website that only has 3 different types of web parts or portlets which need to go in it. So there's Webpart X, Webpart Y, and Webpart Z. So in every specific drop zone, it'll say, okay, here this drop zone contains widget X. I'll execute the Webpart importer for X. Once it'll execute that Webpart importer, and then it will place that portlet into the drop zone. So how the Webpart importer works, similar to the layout importer, these are specialized importers for each given web part which exists within the site. So for example, there's really basically 2 types of web parts which exist. There are the ones which are tied to the Liferay native or also SharePoint native functionality, and I'll give you a perfect example. This is just standard web parts, web content. So the Liferay version of this is a web content display portlet or journal articles. And in SharePoint, they have something called content types, which also just is represented by HTML markup. So that's the first type of portlet that we need to import. And the second type of portlet are the custom applications which exist within the SharePoint site. So I'll give a very simple example of one which we've come across in the past. Imagine an FAQ web part. So what is an FAQ application? It's essentially a list of questions and answers. So you imagine that this is in the source SharePoint application. They have some FAQ application which just has a custom database with questions and answers. So we need to actually create a custom importer for these questions and answers and a custom portlet for displaying these questions and answers, and then import this. So for this example, the SharePoint inspection application, it'll know how to read. It'll know what data it needs to export all the information it needs for the FAQ application. So within the XML, it'll export the full list of questions and the full list of answers, which represent an FAQ. The FAQ importer will also know how to read this data and expect to see the list of questions and answers, and it'll insert these questions and answers into a custom application database, which we put on the side of the Liferay schema. Then what the Webpart importer or what the FAQ importer will do will be that it'll place the FAQ display portlet in that drop zone and assign the data, the FAQ data, to that portlet. The other type of import we do is, as I mentioned earlier, is the native kind of functionality, and the perfect example of this would be actually the web content. So this is basically the web content display import. So what the SharePoint inspection application will do is it'll export all of the HTML markup which it finds within the CMS. After this markup is exported, the markup needs to be filtered and rewritten, which is what I'll get to into the next slide. And then a web content importer will import this markup, this filtered and modified markup, into a journal article, place a web content display portlet in the drop zone, and assign that web content display portlet to that journal article. So I mentioned a few times during the process of the import, we need to remember URLs. And this is the reason why. If we didn't remember the URLs, we would finish our import of the entire CMS, and we'd have a site with 100% broken links. The reason for this is that Liferay simply will not know, it will not import the data, the pages, the documents in the same URLs that SharePoint will contain its own URLs. So you see it here in red. This is a perfect example of a URL for a document. So you have doc1 PDF. This is in SharePoint. This is the document library for SharePoint. But when we import this into Liferay, Liferay has a completely different representation for documents in this document library. So in the markup, we'll have the red text written in the markup, and it'll be a completely broken link. So what we need to do is we need to remember the mapping between the old legacy URLs and the new Liferay URLs, and then perform a transformation on the HTML markup to actually make a site which is fully consistent without any broken links. It's actually quite simple, though. We thought it would be very difficult, but it ended up being a very trivial task. What we do is we inspect all of the HTML markup and do a transformation on the anchor tags, the image tags, the JavaScript tags, and the object tags. And of course, if the site contains some embed elements or some other elements which require links, then on those tags as well. So some of the challenges which we've faced when creating this tool, the first challenge is the representation or the migration of a SharePoint list. I don't know, maybe many of you aren't aware of this or what a SharePoint list is, but it's a native feature of Microsoft SharePoint. Yes, Liferay has its own data lists, but the functionality simply, it does not approximate. So depending on how the content administrators are using SharePoint in the legacy application, you may have to come up with a solution for how you import your SharePoint lists. There's two ways of dealing with this. One is to use Liferay native data entities, such as journal articles or collections. The other way to approach this is to use your own custom application databases. So you would create your own table which represents what the data is inside a SharePoint list and import it directly. So that was one of the big challenges we faced when migrating between SharePoint and Liferay, simply because this is functionality which SharePoint offers behind the scenes, and it's actually quite difficult to approximate within Liferay. It's mostly it's custom implementation. The other challenge we had was how to deal with the non-automated portions of the migration. So firstly, the theme. These are the styles, the CSS classes, etc. All of this usually needs to be rewritten. Now, in a happy day scenario, you'll have in the In the legacy SharePoint application, the styles will be very nicely written, and you won't need to change these at all. But in most cases, you have a 5-year-old legacy application with many hacks, many old styles, and you want to maybe clean that up. So that was one of the portions of the non-automated, that was one of the non-automated portions of the migration. The other non-automated portion is the layouts, which I mentioned earlier. You need to approximate all of the SharePoint layouts into Liferay layouts. It's not so difficult though, because this is content. This is a markup which you just need to somehow implement, and usually you have about five or six different types of layouts within an application. The major non-automated portion of the migration is the implementation or the porting of the .NET applications into Java. So this is what you have to bring in a development team for. If you're lucky, you have 0 custom applications, but you might have 50 in the example I mentioned earlier. So you may need a dev team in order to execute this migration as well. We also had some content issues. So the legacy styling support. This is what I mentioned earlier. You might want to consider cleaning this manually. You also have to deal with the URL rewriting, so these are the legacy links, which I described as well. And the last thing you have to deal with is invalid HTML. So in the legacy application, you might have some invalid HTML, which looks fine on their site, but when you do the import, the entire presentation layer it dies. So you also might want to remove the Microsoft bloat, which is contained within the markup. So a very brief summary. I'm told I only have 5 minutes. Yeah. Okay, so a very brief summary of the migration itself. First, we create a SharePoint inspection application, which traverses the CMS in SharePoint, exports the data in XML files and binary files. And the second portion is to create a Liferay import application, which knows how to read this XML and import the data using Liferay APIs or custom APIs for the custom applications which may exist in the SharePoint and therefore the to-be Liferay application. The third point is to do the manual implementation or porting of all the .NET applications into Java. And the last point is to do the URL rewriting to maintain site consistency and to have no broken links. So the results of the migration, we ended up having a fully, or the tool that we created, we ended up having a fully automated SharePoint to Liferay content migration tool. We're also able to repeat this migration across all environments on our own devs or on the customer's dev acceptance test production environments. And lastly, most importantly, it's a reusable tool which we can use and have used in other SharePoint migration projects. Of course, I'll talk about the benefits to the Liferay community. First thing is, of course, this question. We're asked this question quite a lot, so we imagine that the other Liferay partners are also asked, is it possible to actually do a migration from SharePoint into Liferay? So the answer is yes. The tool does exist. We were able to do it. It's possible. The other thing that it does is it actually reinforces the notion that Liferay is a leading competitor in the field of portal technologies. If we can replace a SharePoint application with Liferay, then clearly it proves that Liferay is able to deliver the functionality which is required. This is also possible to do this economically and quickly. The project reference, which I mentioned earlier, this is the largest migration which we executed. This is with JSOB. It's a member of the KBC group, financial group. It's operating out of the Czech Republic. It's the largest supplier of retail financing and housing products in the Czech Republic. It's established in 1964 and is ongoing with further Liferay projects at the moment. Lastly, about ourselves, Emeldi, we're an official Liferay partner in the UK, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. However, we operate throughout all of Europe. We specialize in e-commerce and self-service solutions. We generally cater to tier 1 enterprise organizations within the telecommunications, financial, media, and educational sectors. We're both a services company and a product company with our own e-commerce product on the market today, and we're also going to introduce this into the Liferay marketplace in the near future. That's it.
Yes, for questions, please. What was the motivation to migrate from SharePoint to Liferay? I believe price, cost?
Yeah, well, there's several motivators for the customers who want to do this. We did it because we're getting a lot of requests for this. I imagine one of the major motivators is the cost of ownership of a SharePoint application compared to Liferay. The other quite important motivator is that the customer usually they do this in order to align their technologies. So they might have a standard of using Java, so they want to get rid of all of their .NET applications and port to Java. So this is one of the things that's blocking them from doing this, and they want to make sure that it's actually something that they can do.
Any other question?
You said that the migration can be done economically and quickly, and that's always an interesting remark, obviously. Can you give me an indication on this big project that you did with these thousands of pages? What the size of the source system really was in terms of pages, and how much or how many days you spent to do the full migration?
Okay, so the project itself, which I mentioned, actually. Almost all of the work was involved with the porting of .NET to Java. You can't get around this. You have to actually do the manual. You have to bring in a dev team and do this implementation on your own. When it comes to the actual migration itself, the tool, I mean, what we're able to do now is within about 3 or 4 days, we bring in a SharePoint specialist and a Liferay specialist to examine the source SharePoint application. Sometimes, for example, the implementation partner for SharePoint will do some strange things and twist it or not use the functionality the way it's intended. And we need to actually make sure that what they have is suitable for our tool. This takes about 2 or 3 days. Once we do this, we provide the customer with an estimate for how much work it is. It varies between 2 to 4 weeks, and it's about 2 people, 3 people. So it's not very much.
Okay. That's interesting. You also said in the beginning of your presentation that you worked mostly with SharePoint 2007. Do you have any comments on the new version of SharePoint 2010?
Well, this is the Liferay conference, but I don't really have too much experience with SharePoint 2010. But I'm glad you did ask that question, because one thing which I do have in the earlier slides, I'll go to it. This is a bit. So here you see I specifically say 2007 in Liferay 6.0, but actually I can take this a bit further, a few more levels. We can actually do this migration into any version of Liferay because we use Liferay services. We don't use any deprecated API calls, so this is possible to do in Liferay 6.1, for example, or upcoming 6.2. Similarly, because the inspection application is standalone, we're able to, what we have in the middle is the export package, and this is just a data representation of everything that needs to be put into a website. So we don't actually need to migrate from SharePoint. We can migrate from Joomla, Drupal, whatever, because you just have to change. You can think of it as an adapter. You just need to change one of the components. Either if you want to go from Liferay 6 to 6.1, you'll do a few tweaks, for example, here and there, and you have an adapter for 6.1. Also, if you want to use SharePoint 2010 or some other CMS or some proprietary CMS, that's fine. You just need to you'll need to do some tweaks if it's SharePoint 2010, but you create an export application which just spits out the data which is in the CMS into an XML. So you're basically, what we do is we've defined the data model, and depending on the source and the target, you just need to make some small changes here and there, but you don't have to touch the rest in order for the migration to work. So currently we're actually looking into doing a migration with some PHP-based databases as well, from some PHP CMS into Liferay. So, yeah. Wasn't exactly your question, but.
My question is, how much functionality of the SharePoint is covered by this migration tool?
Well, the web content, so all the HTML markup which is there, this is represented as content type. So this is all migrated into the Liferay CMS, so into journal articles. We also, based on our experiences, we've done some migration of administration, or we've done some approximation of administration applications, and we've put them into the Liferay CMS as well. These are more about usability features for the content administrators. So I'll give you an example of something which we had to work with. In one of our projects, we had in the SharePoint layout, in the SharePoint markup, they put in macros, which replaced all text. So for example, if they wanted to do a rebranding, they had a macro for the brand name, and they can just do a string. Basically what would happen was that macro would do a string replace of some configuration option in the CMS. So there'd be a 2-pass rendering. The rendering would check for the macro, do the string replace, and then render the markup. So for example, we did implement this. I'm not saying it's a good or bad feature, but we have things like this which are also implemented, which we have in our portfolio for this migration.
I think there was one more question. Yes.
How long did it take to run the migration script in the last production stage?
The actual execution time?
Yes.
Under an hour. I'm trying to think about, actually what took longer was the export. No, sorry, what took longer was the import. The export, we can just do it at any point. So we had a snapshot, which was just a package. And then the import took about 40 minutes, between 40 minutes and an hour. Also, though, it should be noted that once you do the migration, there are some manual steps that you have to take. For example, you might want to set, depending on your infrastructure, your topology, you need to set some virtual hosts. This is all done in the Liferay control panel. So there are some things you need to do. You may need to create a page here or there, but it's generally 99.9% automated.
But you have to keep the site down during this time then?
No. Well, what you do is you have a SharePoint site operational. You set up your Liferay site. You take your snapshot. You do your import, you test it, and then you just change it on the content switch. You just direct it to Liferay once you're ready.
And what about changes happening in the SharePoint site during your migration?
Yeah, so so there's several ways to deal with it. We decided to actually impose a snapshot. So there's let's call it a soft freeze date. We take a snapshot based on this date, and then after this, we have to document all the changes, and these are manual changes. The reason is you can never possibly guess what business will come up with in the next, in the upcoming month or so, that they might need to react to something that happens in the market, for example. So you can't guess this. You just have to, at a certain point, you make a freeze date, and everything needs to be documented and then manually migrated. This generally works quite well.
Okay, thank you.
Just one more question here.
I would like to ask, how do you validate that the migration was correct? Because you said that you had 1,000 pages. And
yeah, so there's several ways. Obviously testing. You do user acceptance testing. You can export the Liferay sitemap. So for us, actually, it was quite trivial to make sure that the pages were created. You have it. It's very. You can export all this data and compare.
So you have some tool that validates that the page map corrects from the Liferay with the map from the SharePoint. Yes.
Yeah. Well, you can export the sitemap from Liferay and you could compare it to the SharePoint. What actually most of the time in testing and validating is actually to make sure that the look and feel is maintained. Because what you're doing is you're modifying, you're using your own Liferay representation of a layout, and you might want to clean up or change, or it no longer applies some of the styling which was in the legacy application. This changes when you go into the Liferay application. So what ends up happening is you'll go through the site and you'll see, oh, this box needs to be moved a few pixels left or right, or this font needs to be a bit larger, whatever.
Thank you.
So I believe that the time for the questions is up. If anyone has any other question, you can always reach Alistair separately throughout the next 2 days.
Yes, we're at the Emeldi booth, which is just in the lobby there.
Thank you for your time.